Thank you everyone for joining us today for another great Challey Institute Ideas Workshop. Before I introduce our speaker today, just a couple quick notes. For those of you who are joining us, perhaps for the first time remotely, you will see in the Zoom chat feature shortly a link that you can click, and it'll take you to a Google document, and there you can, if you want to, you can tell everyone who you are, and that will also be the place where you can type questions that I will later be able to ask Dr. Pfister after his presentation. So go ahead and click on that document when it appears. And thanks again for attending. Today is exciting for us because this is our first international speaker. So I want to thank, before introducing Dr. Pfister, I want to thank him for taking time out of his Friday night, because I believe it's probably like 9 or 9:30 in the evening there, and of course it's 1:30 here US Central Time. So thank you for giving us some of your Friday evening. Dr. Jan Pfister is the senior lecturer at the Department of Accounting and Finance at Turku School of Economics and a research fellow at the House of Innovation at Stockholm School of Economics. His research focuses on management, control systems, creativity and innovation, and performance measurement and management. He is also interested in broader societal changes based on the emergence of innovative technologies, including digital platforms and ecosystems, which of course is a very timely issue right now during this pandemic. His dissertation, Managing Organizational Culture for Effective Internal Control from Practice to Theory, was published as a book by Springer and won the Best Paper Award at the Research Ethics Symposium of the American Accounting Association. Dr. Pfister received his PhD from the University of Zurich. So please help me welcome today's speaker, Dr. Jan Pfister.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Share here slides. Yeah, so thank you very much for the opportunity to present here my ongoing research on the topic innovating under pressure and the speeding up of organizational life. And to start with, I think I want to immediately bridge this topic to the current situation, which of course causes a lot of issues around the globe, but exactly innovating under pressure and the speeding up of organizational life relates very much to this, what we are experiencing at the moment. And to show what I mean with this, well, innovating under pressure, it has to do with, of course, that we want to have a vaccine, or the global effort to create vaccines that are effective. And there has been just progress now most recently. But when I mean innovating under pressure, it has also to do with our daily life. So nature has kind of provided here a challenge that we can't anymore proceed with our normal routines of every day, how we are used to it. And this creates new questions of wearing masks, social distancing, and many disruptions of how we do the things that we have just been used to every day. So this is one issue on innovating under pressure. And then, of course, a more problematic one is also the businesses and how they actually reach the customers, what kind of value they can create, and also how they capture value in this situation. So there are really new challenges going on, and this means that many businesses, I think, need to innovate in order to cope with the new situation. And another aspect of this is also to do that in a responsible manner, as of course then many businesses are at risk of also having to lay off people. So how to do that best is very much innovation under pressure. Then finally, we can say anything that is innovation under pressure is related to the freedom that we also enjoy. We enjoy to be free in what we do. And innovating under pressure means we have constraints and we need to deal with those constraints in one way or another. So that's one part that relates to the pandemic and also to the topic that I'm presenting here. And then the other one is speeding up of life. And speeding up of life, by this, I mean two aspects. One is that we tend to do things faster because of technological progress, all kinds of things. But also we need to be more flexible. And that's the other side of speeding up of life. So on the one hand, you do things faster, but then also you have to be more flexible. And when we relate that to the current pandemic, the interesting aspect of this is, especially at the beginning, I think in many places where there were lockdowns, it actually slowed down life to some extent. So for some, I think not for everybody, but for some, it was kind of flights were canceled, meetings were canceled, and suddenly there was a bit more time available. And that kind of slowed down the normal temporal rhythm we are in. But of course, we can also see now we have adapted to this life. We can use much more digital technologies like Zoom or other technologies to actually do much more, because now we don't need to necessarily travel. We can just do the same things remotely. And by that, we can see that life speeds up again. We do even more things at once. So then this really, based on this background, is the question, why and how does this all happen? And of course, one thing that drives all this is the market economy, capitalist system, that for sure has a big impact here. And we have many benefits from this. So if you think of this nice car as an invention, or if you think of the plane, two things that help us overcoming distance and space, so we can move quickly to another place to do whatever we have to do there. And of course, the other side of those technologies is that the information and the communication reduces that we actually need to cross spaces, but that we get the information right on the place we are. So here's a lot of compression of time and space happening through all these innovations. And that is, of course, a great thing. I think we really benefit. Our quality of life has increased. And of course, also thanks to the system, many people are very wealthy. So there are a lot of benefits from this. And related to all these innovations, we can of course also see, well, that the market competition increases the rate of change. And these increases, well, this leads to rapid and disruptive technological change, since companies need to compete, create new services, new products that provide some advantage. And since we have global connectedness and many possibilities to work together, market disruptions are even more possible than in the past, thanks to the technology. And thanks to the technology, we can also see how different ideas travel very quickly. So there is an idea here, it travels through several channels, and it's somewhere at the other end of the planet. And that can happen within seconds, basically. And in this system also, we have more than ever this global market where we have complex ecosystems where we not even anymore fully understand how things connect to each other, but it creates the possibility for a lot of rivalry, a lot of new entrants in those systems. And that makes, of course, change very dynamic and increases that rate of change. And as I said before, also now in this situation with the business models that have to change depending on the market conditions in many industries. So we have here a demand for continuously and renewed business models. Then, of course, customer tastes change. So if you think also now at the moment in this situation, there are different customer tastes, how people want to be served in this moment. And then we have talent and employee mobility. that is much easier possible nowadays than ever, and we can connect all kinds of people around the world. So all these things lead, all these aspects and factors lead to an increased rate of change. And if we add on top of this all those aspects like the regulation and deregulation, depending on the countries, security issues, trade wars, volatile prices, financial downturns, environmental disasters, all that can come up and affect different areas or the entire planet, then we have again more complexity in this. And of course, this can lead to discontinuities, disruptions, convergence, intensity, and new sources of global competition. So to complete this, how we can call this is, as Daveni and all, for example, say, hyper-competitive. Competitive advantage is only temporary, and there is permanent high uncertainty, turbulence, and change, and there is the pressure to innovate based on this. And if we look at a survey by PricewaterhouseCoopers with in the US CFO Pulse survey, where the CFOs have been asked, so what about the current situation will make your company better in the long run? Then we can see here, especially the first 4 points, we can see, well, better resiliency and agility, so being more flexible and adaptive. And then the other one, work flexibility, so being able to work just temporary or work also more from home, and technology investments and leaner operations. So what we see with all those aspects, they have to do with digital technologies and how digital technologies change our life and how we organize companies. And that's why I want to say a few words also about the role of digital technologies. So what do they actually do? How do they change the situation for companies and for people? And of course, one is here the connectivity. So we are more connected. Then we have more automation, which improves the speed of workflows and which can make things more secure when they are well programmed. Then we have augmentation, so work tasks that are enhanced through technology. And we can see that this helps a lot in speeding up what we are doing. And it also helps in flexibility, so that we are more flexible what we do, at what time, and that we can do different things at different tasks at once. So that's one side of it. But then, of course, we have here the other side, that is the fear that those machines replace humans. That's one. And there is the famous catalog of fear that several scholars have been studying, especially from the University of Oxford, this well-known catalog of fear. Then we have increased pressure, that we need to work faster according to the speed and the higher expectations. So that's a bit the downside of those digital technologies. And if we think of those digital technologies, especially communication technology, then sociologist Judy Wajcman from London School of Economics, she has written a book on the time pressure paradox. It's called Pressed for Time, the Acceleration of Life in Digital Capitalism. And I think this shows nicely digital communication technology, they compress time and space. They make it possible that we can be anywhere, anytime where we want to be. They make it possible that we increase the pace of work and interpersonal sociability, so we can be in work and non-work life and so on. And of course, they also promise to free out resources in organization, as we can do things faster, and by that we gain time that we can use in a different way. However, studies also show that the subjective experience of people is, despite their work maybe the same amount of time, they feel more rushed and hurried in the digital age. And there are more difficulties in coordinating social spheres across social spheres, coordinating different meetings, and again, also with the non-work life and work life. And generally, people feel it intensifies their work and fragments their workday. So that's the time pressure paradox. And I think many people can relate to this, but this is something we see. So from this background that I just mentioned, I want to now turn towards my own research and relate particularly to two case studies that I've done. And related to that, I have these two questions. So one is how to cope with pressure to innovate. And related to this, I have a study of an accounting department of a large US technology company. We call it pseudonym GlobSearch. It's a very well-known company, but the service that they have, we all use, most of us every day. That's one study that I want to look at. And then a second question is how to cope with the speeding up of life. And here I have another case study of a company also that we know very well, a global market disruptor that provides a digital communication platform, which we have the pseudonym WordCom. And this is a company we also use quite often. So to the first study, which is Innovating Under Pressure and has to do with this accounting department of this global US technology company. Here, the point of that company is that it had extreme growth. So there were up to 100 acquisitions per year. There were several thousand people that they hired every year additionally. And there were also an enormous amount of new services and products that they provided. And here, the focus on the accounting and compliance department, which is a support function, which is typically rather stable. In this case, it was highly dynamic and highly challenged by all these changes that they had constantly. So this is what we focus on here. And what we observed from this research is that they set stretch targets to employees in that department, very tough target that seemed impossible to achieve, and they achieved it over years. So here I give a statement from the study from the head of finance, Europe, Middle East, and Asia in 2011. That was at the beginning when we followed this initiative. And he said, the CFO said, maintain the quality, but just give it to me quicker, get it done quicker. And the idea is if you can do it something quicker, you will eliminate waste and inefficiencies. And by doing that, you will eliminate or reduce cost. And this was because before they were constantly just running after things just to make sure that compliance and accounting was maintained and that they were compliant. But in that moment, they started, okay, we need now also to really force those support functions to become more efficient. And here then another statement by the corporate controller at the time. And now next year, we are going to improve that number by 20%, okay, and year after improve it 20% again, and year after 20% again. So every year, those employees had to become 20% more productive, and that is has been very much challenging for them. And what is the outcome of this study? We can see, well, after 2 years, here's a statement by the corporate controller. You know, people can achieve these productivity gains that are much greater than people really realized when they're pushed to do it. You need to only look at any economic study, like no one's going to say that people are getting 20% more productive every year. And then after 5 years, well, GlobSearch as a company was growing at an annual growth rate of about 20 to 25% over a 5-year period. Whether you measure that in revenue or you measure it in headcount, whereas our team, over like the same 5-year period, our annual growth rate was only 10%. So they managed here to achieve those stretch targets. And to illustrate this, what we looked at, so if we see here the target difficulty on the right side, and we see the performance level. And here is the target level difficulty. Then what motivates people usually the most is the most difficult target that they are committed to pursue. So that's the challenging target. And even though they might not achieve that target itself, they will be providing the highest performance possible. And of course, if the target is more difficult, then the motivation goes down. It seems unreasonable to go after this target. Now, in this case, when you have stretch targets, then you go into an area where it's perceived to be impossible under the current processes or current process efficiencies. And that means it demands creativity and risk-taking in innovating the processes. So only then it is possible to achieve this. And now what we see in this case, they have achieved this. They have maybe not fully achieved it, but they have achieved close to that. And what we see is that they had a very particular way of personnel and cultural control in that organization and how that was interrelated with those stretch targets. So the combination of this. And then to explain this a bit more, so why was it possible to achieve these stretch targets? From a theoretical perspective, we have in economic theory the motivation crowding in and crowding out effect. And what this essentially means is motivation crowding in effect is how do people react to an instrument, to something that they are forced to do, so an extrinsic motivator. And when we have the crowding in effect, people will respond to a specific target, but they will still be totally focused on the task and doing it because they like the task. The reward and the goal, or the achievement of the goal and the reward that they get is an additional thing. But when it's the other way around, that people start focusing more on the reward and the instrumentality that they are promised, then you have the motivation crowding out effect. And this is something that you can't have for stretch targets, so you need to have this motivation crowding in effect. Well, and this theory basically roots in the psychology with self-determination theory, which is all about whether people feel self-determined in achieving those targets or whether they feel it's external to them, so not really what they want to achieve. So therefore, a company that wants to achieve stretch targets needs to create an environment where people internalize the stretch targets and make them really be committed to those targets. Now, what we saw in this study, to just show a bit the examples here, so why were these employees self-determined despite the pressure that was given to them? So if you look at self-determination theory, you have those three psychological needs that need to be fulfilled. And one of them is that employees or anybody that is exposed to an extrinsic motivator needs to feel competent to achieve it. The second one is they need to feel related to that particular institution, people, whoever it is that actually enforces that extrinsic motivator. And the third one is that they need to feel autonomous. So they need to feel autonomy in pursuing this. And I mean, the first two are relatively straightforward, but if you are pressed to innovate, it doesn't really feel like autonomy. So how that worked was, and I give here a few examples. So one is that they actually included stretch targets into the corporate work philosophy. So it was clear for employees that part of that culture is to think big and to achieve stretch targets and to have that part of the work philosophy. Another one was that they had social, physical, financial perks at the workplace, which made this company really attractive, right? And like a place where people want to be. And by that, they attracted a lot of potential employees, and they could be very selective in who they hire. Another thing that it is training that was particularly tailored for achieving stretch targets. And when I say here training in that accounting department, it was particularly those accountants would change their focus, so they would become more skilled in programming, more skilled in training, more skilled in developing procedures to outsource and to eliminate processes. So their focus changed from doing the actual accounting work to much more becoming this kind of innovator. Then they have also this norm, that the social norm, that everybody should see themselves as a subject expert, so a subject matter expert, and really strive to be that. And that's a bit different than somebody kind of just says you should do it. They really had this culture of everybody should become an expert in what they're doing. They also used the measurement that they have and successful process innovations, but especially also the outcomes, the results that they could show to as positive feedback. So once they realized after 1-2 years, well, actually we can do this, we can really be more efficient, and the numbers also show it in the result, then they became more motivated through that, and it reinforced their competence here. And another thing that was important, that it was really demanded that they take risks, and demand that also it is okay if they make failures, certain things don't pan out. But this culture was pushing this, that they really go for new processes. And of course, always with quality in mind, especially in this particular area. Then they had also a collaborative and easygoing approach, so that there was this relatedness supported, because people like to work together and team was very important for them. So now the combination of all those things, they have supported that they felt competent in doing this, they felt related to each other and also to the engineering side, that the accountants also wanted to be innovators, and they had autonomy, because in the end, actually, this was fully aligned with them, because they wanted to be innovators also in accounting. And then they do that from an internalized perspective, and not because somebody pushes an accountant to take risk, who is by nature rather risk averse. So this is something we describe in more detail in this paper, which I've collaborated with my colleague here at the University of Turku, Kari. So here we discussed this much more in detail, how those different control mechanisms support self-determined behavior. But another aspect that is, I think, interesting in this context of digital technologies from this study is this question here: what happens to the accountant in the future, especially as we know about this catalog of fear, where accountants and auditors are by some predicted to kind of disappear and being replaced by machines. So what we learn from this study is that rather the skill set shifts, that in this case here, especially, they have become more process innovators, but they had to have still these accounting skills. The skill set is rather broadening, and the work itself is more challenging, but it is not necessarily that they are replaced. Some of it maybe, but not yet robots for this. Good, so to conclude from this first study, the main message is, so innovating under pressure needs basically self-determined behavior, and it needs environments where the self-determined behavior is supported. And we have here used self-determination theory to show what that is. So that leads me to the second study, which is about the speeding up of organizational life. And this is another very well-known company that is interesting because it has expanded enormously fast globally. It has had this digital communication platform, and then relatively quickly disrupted the communication market, and by that was able to expand. And in this study, we have an interest in understanding how did the controls in that organization support this development. That's a study I'm doing with two colleagues, Peter Pida from the University from Tampere University, and David Otley from Lancaster University. And the intriguing part, right from the start of studying the control systems in this organization, was that these managers, when they looked back at the development of the organization, they said, you know, we had a very different way of how we managed the organization, because we used our own product internally, and this own product had a chat function and also a video call function, and they used that to organize themselves. So each team had a chat group. The organization was all built around these chats or instant messages, and they did that at a time when this was not yet so common, and they replaced emails to do this. So, and here a statement from the site director of operations, and he says, well, the digital communication platform has a huge effect on time saving for the organization, because so many more decisions and discussions can happen synchronically. And then he continues, you open a conversation, you read new messages related to topic, you respond if your response is needed, and then you continue to the next conversation. So basically you constantly jump through virtual meetings, and what is good about it is that you can do that when you have time. So that's how they worked. So each employee had basically about 50 such chat groups and was constantly looking at where do they need to respond. And then another statement here by the senior project manager, it was very, very fast. And we did so many things that I can't understand why not every team or company worked that way. So what they basically demonstrated relatively naturally is to move ahead fast as a relatively substantial organization. So the platform was already in all countries, most countries around the world. They had 500 employees in different locations, and they remained extremely agile as an organization, even with substantial size. And without actually implementing these agility principles just to some part, but it was more a natural process that they had. And by that, they also pioneered remote work, I think in a very particular way, while other companies also did that at the time, but they were very, very much into this being constantly in interaction at home or in the office. They could be wherever they wanted, and multitasking was the norm of their daily work. But what is really also striking of this case is when we interview people, they were all very enthusiastic, especially about the particular time of this company, when it had substantial size and it was very flexible. And here we have a statement, so the work-life balance was 0. I think the 6 months after I joined were hell. I would be in the office at 6 a.m., 5 a.m. and finished 11 or midnight every day. So that was one side of it, but in the same interview, same employee would also say about how they like to work there, I loved it. I actually really, really enjoyed it. And one of the things I really enjoyed was that it was a small team at the time, very dynamic. And we have many such examples. This is a bit an extreme one, but many that exactly say similar things. They have long working hours, a lot of interaction, but liked to really work like this. So how can we explain that this is possible? And one thing why they like to work there is for sure the vision and the mission that they have. So they had meaningful work. They changed the global communication market, and they knew they connected people that have been out of touch for a long time, and suddenly they could communicate for free, and that made many people around them very happy. And that, I think that was something we repeatedly heard in this. But what they also had, the platform actually helped to enhance kind of a happy family, in the sense that they were very team oriented. There was total transparency because everybody could see what's going on. They worked in direct communication all the time, and by that created also a certain bond, and people were available and responsive. So that's one part of it. Another important part of it was that the visibility of the platform substituted the visibility that you usually need in larger organizations. So you can have a startup up to 50 people or so working very informal without much bureaucracy. But if you get more employees in different locations, it becomes very difficult to create the visibility. But they did that through this platform very much. So they had instant decision making. They evaluated and gave feedback through the platform. They had also some weekly meetings, but much happened through that. They could structure teams, they could authorize teams through these chat functions, and they also had instant documentation, which they actually used for archiving, so without writing many manuals for this. And of course, this relates here to Burns and Stocker's old theory, even where we have the organic and the mechanistic organization. So the platform created kind of a visibility that you could replace partially mechanistic organization. And to make this a bit clearer here in this with how the platform substituted the bureaucracy. So one is as I said, the performance measurement and management. They had actually not very tough targets for some in the organization, but generally the targets were low and they always outperformed them. So very different from the other case. They had at the time fixed salaries without bonuses, but they would renegotiate positions. They had a flat hierarchy, everybody could reach out to everyone, and they reduced meetings. So they had not many fixed time. They tried to communicate much through that digital platform. And that means employees felt free, they felt entrepreneurial, and they felt that they could really express themselves. So this is another case where we can see how life can speed up. And from these two cases, I think I can now summarize a few learnings that are important from these cases. So what is a learning? One is acceptance of the challenge. I think in both organizations, we see that they, and especially in the first one with the stretch targets, they have accepted the challenge. They did not resist it, but they took it on board. And related to that, they believe in what is done and they have meaning in the work, what they do. They really have many times expressed this, how they really like to, one is more information, the other more communication oriented, they find that purposeful. Then they feel self-determined, and especially in the second company, we heard so often that they said, this company had no controls, we were free, even though of course they had controls, but maybe they were not felt as such. So that means these employees could really be self-determined and pursue what they had to do, the tasks. Then something that also came up repeatedly is that they have been humble and respect the people around you. So they, the cultures were typically so that it is about expressing oneself or expressing the organization, and not so much a paradigm where they have to push down others to get a position. And that's something that is repeatedly, that is partially still happening in this competition, but it is a strong cultural sign, I think, in both of these organizations. And then the last here, technology can help replace bureaucracy. So technology shouldn't actually enhance and make bureaucracy stronger, but actually we learn here that technology can help replace bureaucracy, and that means people can focus on the meaningful work and not the control task from a bureaucracy. So overall, to bring this to a point, we could now say we have kind of seen how to achieve productivity, innovation, and speed, and nearly these two companies provide a manual because they have been successful. And I could, in principle, stop here the presentation, but I would want to go one step further before I do so. And this one step here is there are, of course, some societal problems that we should consider when we think of these two companies. So what is the problem after all? I think these companies set new performance standards in the markets, and by this they create a certain status quo. because they are success examples. We want to learn from them what they do. And these things we want to imitate. And this is to some extent, of course, very good. But we have to still then think, what kind of innovations are we doing when this happens, that these examples are copied? And one example here is, if you think of the amount of work time that they spend. So it is great that these companies create this appealing work environment and make work time meaningful and valuable. I think that's something everybody can just welcome, and this is a great thing. But what it also does, of course, is it gives enormous value to the time spent at work. And this time competes with time spent in other social spheres, like family, friends, non-work life, because the work time is very attractive. Another one is it creates an illusion of being free. So if there is a general expectation to work long hours in the organization, which means everybody works long, you need to also work long. And this is not necessarily free as such. Another thing that also Judy Wajcman mentions and emphasizes in her work is, and also in these two companies that we study is very typical, most personnel are young, male, and do not have children in those companies. And therefore they have, of course, more flexibility to work long hours. So I think this is a however that we need to consider. The second one is the work versus non-work life. So great to create work flexibility. You can be wherever you want. And we see this now during the pandemic. You don't need to be 8 hours in the office. You can work from ever. And that is a great flexibility that really enhances, of course, to some extent, our quality of life. However, there is, again, a however, social cost, because this can relinquish free, uninterrupted time in non-work life. And when there are no boundaries set, then this potentially exploits employees when they basically have to be all the time available, even though they have free time, but they should still be kind of connected. And that is an aspect of this. And now the third point I want to mention is that through all this speeding up and being connected, we are forced to multitask, right? And to achieve several deadlines at the same time. And that is, in principle, also interesting. You can work on many things at once and get forward with it. But it can also create the problem that we need to follow the workflow. So for example, we can't take some time off to do something in depth, especially many companies, you can hear that people can't actually block some time to work on something in depth because somebody wants a meeting, and if they don't get that meeting, these people can't not move forward. And through that, nobody has ever properly time to think on something in depth, or less time. Of course, they still have, but sometimes not. And this can also, of course, then create health and well-being issues. So to come to my final comment about this, so there are benefits from the market economy, and they are absolutely clearly there. But then there is, of course, the issue that if we speed up constantly, and this is naturally what's happening, we can also become victims of the system to some extent if this is not steered, because everything will increase like this. And this, I think, has implications for research to make more visible these things, and for practice to think about how to deal with those work-life balance issues and with the tempo and where to actually slow down in which areas. And it can also relate to policy, that these aspects are included in discussions much more than they are, so that we are aware of them. And that leads then to the three final questions from this presentation. So in all this, basically, we need to go back to, do the innovations really increase the quality of life? Do they provide more meaningful work so that we can focus our time on the meaningful part, and the less meaningful can be reduced? And then the last is, how about health and well-being in general? So how are these aspects included in the discussion. Good, so that's the comments.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Can you hear me okay, Jan?
Yes, very good.
Okay, excellent. So I've got some questions. I'll start with, does anyone in our, so we have a live audience and a remote audience here today. So I'll start with questions from our live audience. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Jan, we have a question from the live audience about the first study, and specifically looking at that company over time. Did you look at in the long term any effects like burnout or other types of related outcomes from switching to those targets? That was the question, right?
Yeah, so I think burnouts, we didn't specifically look at it. It was more part of the study, but it was something that they continuously would manage. And they would also, during the study, part of this, which I didn't mention now, was that they also introduced a new measurement system to really follow those productivity improvements. And as part of these measurements, they also introduced more measures to focus on people's health. And it was a constant discussion that it could lead to burnouts and how to manage them. So it was part of the discussion.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a quick follow-up question for that, and then I'm going to switch to the Google Doc questions. But at the end, when you were talking about the kind of pros and cons of, this new, I guess, kind of new way of life, I was thinking, to what extent do you think, because this is so new and novel, like remote work and these digital platforms and, the kind of flexible work, to what extent do you think companies will just sort of figure this out and self-regulate that? Like, for instance, you can imagine getting a bunch of employees saying, I'm just getting too many emails on the weekend, or I don't have time to do the deep thinking like you suggested. And so do you think part of this is just a function of it's a little bit Wild West right now and people will kind of figure this out? Or do you think there's something inherent in this way of work that we're going to really need more structure in place to protect people's time and freedom?
Yeah, I think, that's a difficult question because it's difficult to predict how that goes. But I think one aspect of this is, especially with this company that used this chat function, this was a long time ago that they started doing this. And if you think how, for example, emails are persistent in how we use them today, even though many people actually, you hear this quite often, right? They complain about that email maybe is a bit rigid in some sense. And that, for example, these employees, they very much kind of say there is a better way of working. Of course, now in recent years, this has changed already quite a bit. So that's one aspect where you see that things can be quite sticky in the routines of people. And then the other aspect is, whether kind of the market regulates this itself, that companies will adapt and will be kind of from employees and from the pressure generally have to regulate work-life balance. I think that's for sure an option, that this will happen. And also when you look at younger generations, at least here, we can see that there is a lot of emphasis on work-life balance. So there will be more newer generation maybe that emphasizes that even more. But on the other hand, it's also so, I think Paul Adler calls this the sociological ambivalence of bureaucracy, where we see that bureaucracy has, on the one hand, is here for coordination and kind of working well together. But the other side of these controls and bureaucracy is also that it potentially exploits employees, because naturally the companies want to get the best out of their employees. So therefore the employees in that sense always exposed to this potential risk. And I think what I tried to say with this presentation is that those technologies open up totally new opportunities for this kind of exploitation if it is not managed and if it is not made visible, because it is opening up basically everything. Before it was clear you have an 8-hour work week, 8-hour work day. It starts at that time and it ends at that time, and that's the time. But now it is kind of open space. So therefore, difficult to say, but I would say it's a combination.
Thanks. So here's a question from our remote audience. That's a very practical question. So this I like, and we're academics and educators here, so we think this is important. Do you have any suggestions on how to get our accounting students ready for this fast changing environment?
Yeah, I guess for accounting students, I think it's important that they still learn very much basic accounting techniques and that they have a good understanding of this. This needs to be always part of it. But then, of course, it is another part to invite more practitioners and maybe also bring in those more programming skills, all those new skills that I mentioned already. So looking at what is needed to improve processes, to manage contractors, to do all those aspects. So that, and maybe also combining it with work on the data scientist, so to combine skills in that way. So I think the accountant will stay relevant for quite some time. It just needs different skills. And for that, I think you need to work with those practitioners that actually do this.
Thanks. Any more questions from the live audience? Okay, I'll go back to our remote audience. Is there a sacrifice of information reliability for the relevance due to the stretch target policy?
Sorry, so can you say again?
Yeah, I'll read it again. Is there a sacrifice of information reliability for relevant due to the stretch target policy?
So I guess this refers to if you have stretch targets, especially in, let's say, accounting and compliance area, that this creates a certain risk for this. Well, I guess so in this case that I studied, it was always very clear that quality was number one. So that was strongly emphasized. And I think the innovations were happening in such a way that the quality would not be sacrificed in a material way. So maybe there were small issues, but they would immediately be covered. So I think there it is again. How is the performance measurement set up? Is it only productivity, or is quality still kept priority number one, and then comes productivity, so that the trade-off remains clear? And I think that's the key. And then the third aspect would also be to bring in risk. So how much risks are involved in different areas, of course, risk, quality. So yeah, it's all about managing those trade-offs.
Yeah. So we have another question related back to the teaching and academic issues. So does your school where you work at incorporate artificial intelligence in your accounting program? Clearly we have somebody here who wants to do something in the accounting program. So do you guys have an AI or artificial intelligence component in your program at your institution?
So I think these people that teach this, I think they invite practitioners to bring this in. I think we could still do more on this, but I think it really brings this topic up, that the collaboration with those practitioners is really helpful here.
Okay, we have another question for. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I actually had a similar question. So I'll repeat the question to you because you probably couldn't totally hear it from our audience. So it's about the work-life balance issue. Is it possible that some of these programs and platforms will actually allow, more opportunity in the sense that it can, sure, you talked about you have young males and they might, if they don't have families, they might have more free time, but at the same time, you might have other people with different family arrangements that being able to work remotely or go somewhere for a while. I mean, I was actually, when you were talking, I was thinking of the example of, imagine someone who needed to go far away to do caregiving for an older parent or something like that, and the ability to bring their laptop with them and just have Wi-Fi for the, as they're set up for their workplace might actually make it more diverse beyond just young males. So do you have thoughts on how these things could actually push workplaces in the opposite direction of being not just young males, but more people who have other family constraints and circumstances?
Yeah. So actually, in this second company with the digital platform, part of this was, of course, many of them were male and young and all these criteria, but there were also people that had families, and why they also created kind of this family feel, I think, as a culture, was that they could just bring them to work, and they had a place for children, so children would just run through the office in certain sections, and even they could bring their pets and children, whatever. So that was all allowed. And then the other side is, of course, they were very flexible going away, as you just mentioned with your example, that they could remotely work. So in that way, and those people we interviewed, they were also very much saying that this was special in the sense that they could combine it. And yeah, now here you can ask, that's a good thing, because then you have all flexibility, but of course it does also this, that it becomes very blurred what is work and what is not work, and you can then be kind of all the time available. So it's a very difficult line, and I guess there are different ways of doing that and different preferences for different people.
Yeah. Oh, okay. No. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's yeah. You mentioned it the first time and I forgot to say it. So yeah, so just kind of a follow-up to that question. What about the ability to, a company who's just recruiting or hiring people locally and having kind of the traditional 8 to 5 structure is somewhat limiting, but what about how does this influence or the ability to get people from potentially all over the world who want to work different times and have different hour structures, and what is that? That's kind of what you're asking, right?
So how this
Oh, okay. So what if you get, like, if different companies had, like, you might have one company that wants people to work 8 hours a day, but another company that's like, we want 12 hours a day, and another company is like, well, we don't really care when you work or how much you work, or I think it's like, I think I remember reading, maybe it's Google, or there are companies that are like, we don't keep track of hours or anything. Like, it's all outcome based, right? So if you're the person who can get your lines of code written in 2 hours a day, then you can go surf the rest of the day. We don't care. Or if you're, so just your thoughts on those sort of different, bringing, different companies and being able to access different people from around the world, right? Is that, yeah.
I guess this is a good thing to have variety. So then kind of it's a different offer provided by different organizations, and if there's a market, then everybody can kind of find the right place. If of course, if there are these places, so there is no issue with this. And of course, I mean, I didn't. That's what I say. I mean, one way this is providing all these great opportunities to work with people all around the world, which you couldn't do otherwise. No question. So the advantages are amazing, basically. But on the other side, you have these issues that need to be regulated, especially if you say you are, for example, outcome oriented. Then, of course, when you see that it just takes 2 hours for something, and you realize there is more time available, so we could actually put the outcome higher to get them right. So where is the limit? Because you can always then increase the standards, and especially if you are in a very competitive market and work like this, then there is a potential to increase that permanently.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, we're out of time, so we'll leave it at that. Then everyone, please help me once again thank Jan Pfister for his presentation.
Yep.
And thank you. You'd be up past my bedtime where you're at, so thank you again for being willing to take some time out of your evening for us.
Thank you.